Okay. Hey everyone, we are running 11th session of Sitecore Virtual Headless Development User Group, and today we have two special guests. We have Varun from Netlify, and I want to say Varun is our voice of our Sitecore community at Netlify. So use your chance to ask this guy any questions you would like. Um, I would think Varun is our ambassador there. And we have a very special presentation by Rich Seal. I believe there are no people who do not know Rich Seal, and his presentation today will be very special. It will be about building your own head application with Go and using HTMX. Just HTMX alone is something that makes my curiosity already. Okay, with that in mind, I passing control to Varun, and you are good to go.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Martin. Thanks for having me. And you know what? I'm actually really looking forward to what Richard is gonna show us. But here's the kicker. I missed your talk, Richard, at Symposium, and I think I'm gonna miss it again because I'm also at Atlanta SUG. So I'm gonna be presenting here after I present at the Headless user group. But I'm also like super excited about what Richard is gonna show. But without further ado, and I'm going to probably take about 35 minutes. And, you know, if we have time, we could probably dive into a demo. But I'll at least walk us um, through getting started with and choosing the right approach and picking the right, you know, front end cloud hosting provider and how all that comes together if you're going from Sitecore Classic or Legacy or XP to XM Cloud, or even if you're on XP and you're taking your first steps to building your headless sites using Sitecore. But let me kind of share my screen and kind of dive into some of the content first, and then we'll see if we can get to a demo. Sitecore and Netlify better together. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Varun Nehra. I am the head of value engineering at Netlify. Prior to this, I've been in professional services industry for almost 20 years. And before I joined Netlify, I was the chief digital officer of All2Do, also a Sitecore Platinum partner. Was there for 5 years. We did some amazing projects and worked together and worked with more, actually at this point, hundreds of clients in various capacity, looking back at 20 years, but 5-time Sitecore MVP. Like I said, I'm in Atlanta, and this little quote from me kind of always steers me in the right direction: empowering digital transformation with composable solutions for agile, scalable growth. So I went through a few iterations to say, you know, why do I do this, and you know, why composable, and what does it mean to be composable? I'm going to talk a little bit about that and why that has kind of come like full circle for me, especially now at Netlify. So we'll talk a little bit about this, and in the context of web modernization, in the context of just moving from legacy way of building sites and the web to something a little bit modern with headless and mock and Jamstack and all that good stuff. But to kind of introduce you to Netlify, if you haven't heard about us, we are the company, our co-founders actually invented, coined the term Jamstack. And from the early days of doing some of that to where we are today is more than 3,500 plus services that are packaged together in the platform. We've been in the business more than 10 years. At any given time, we're serving more than 1 billion unique visitors, more than 50 million sites and apps powered by us, quite a bit of internet there. And we're well past our 5 million mark. I mean, we're more than 6.5 million developers who have tried and tested and built our product, and we operate across multiple verticals. So if you think of technology, we're really very well known in the technology space. Everybody from, you know, Meta to Figma to, you know, Kubernetes to just, you know, San Francisco and the Bay Area, we're really well known. But beyond that, we have some very prominent businesses and enterprises that care a lot about their brand and their business and their customer experience, that have chosen to host their customer experience with us. While they are all Azure and AWS customers, they still chose Netlify. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So the way I want to explain, you know, why, if you're thinking about modernization, web modernization, think about this 3-step workflow, right? And this is where Netlify has kind of taken this on to say, how do we get you, the builders of the web, from inspiration to production without any chores? So if you look at the 3 steps here, from creation to automation to operation, the idea is creation happens with you, right? You and the designers, you create content, you engineer apps, you build customer experience. That creation aspect is what you're doing day in and day out. But then there's a level of automation that is required to get that creation to production, and where you actually host and operate it flawlessly. So if you're looking at that, what we're where sort of like, why does Netlify exist, right? It came in to say, well, this way of managing bills and releases, and let me know if you see any boxes that maybe these Zoom boxes, they're kind of floating all over the place, if that's obstructing some of the UI. But the idea is, you start with code and collaboration, and you see all of these steps that we're all used to, and they're kind of in red to say, well, these are less than ideal, right? You spend a lot of time, once you've built a feature, once you've coded your application, to get it to production. It goes through non-prod, it goes through dev, integration, staging. Then there's all of these CI/CD pipelines and all the infrastructure and apps that you need to manage all of that, just to make sure that your feature gets to production and runs and at scale. So what this does is it slows down the time to market. It's just not the most ideal way in which you want to build the web of the future. So where Netlify comes in and it says is, well, that automation aspect of it, now it's going to be much, much faster. Don't worry about all the steps it takes to get to production. We will manage that for you, right? Things like, you get infinite non-prod environments, you get, instant rollbacks, you get, deployment previews, you get all these features that you don't have to worry about, and we are taking care of that for you. Now, while we're doing that, you're thinking about hosting, your newly built a modern JavaScript framework, or any other, way in which you're going from like classic way of building your web app to what you're working on now. You want to also leverage modern compute as you're leveraging modern technologies. And what I mean by that is, you're going from what we know traditionally to be legacy compute with, client server architecture, what we all do with Sitecore, where we're able to host, content management, content delivery on IaaS, PaaS, and even containers, right? But what you want to start leveraging are edge networks, right? And edge caching with serverless compute, with webhooks and API-driven architectures, and leverage that GraphQL. So invariably, as you're going from Sitecore XP to XM Cloud, you're finding yourself working with Experience Edge. You're going to find yourself working with webhooks. You're going to want to deploy at the edge for that perfect lighthouse scores. So we're bringing that to you, and we're doing it in a very seamless way. So that's what I'm hoping I can show you in a demo. But I want to go one step further to kind of explain this sort of architecture. And this is a reference architecture. If you're that modern headless developer, architect, tech lead, right, and you're imagining, well, how should I think about this modern? Actually, I'm going to do one thing. So I'm going to go 2 steps further, and I'm going to say, well, if you know Sitecore, then you know what this looks like, right? On the left-hand side, you're looking at content management, content delivery, and multiple instances with load balancing, very traditional way of hosting what has generally been a monolith. And when we say with Netlify on the right-hand side, we eliminate all of that red stuff on the left-hand side with regards to, how do you manage your firewalls, your networking, your load balancing, your caching, your security. We just kind of bake it into our infrastructure. All you have to do is just focus on that green box, right? Because that's where your businesses are investing dollars in. That's where you want to get that ROI to say, well, what powers your business and what powers that customer experience is what you code in that green box. And now Sitecore offers you all of these products that you can integrate with headlessly, because everything has an API. right? Including CDP personalized, and then you have some identity and access management. But this is like an oversimplified way of looking at what it means to do headless. But if you want to be truly composable, which takes you one step further beyond headless, then I would go back to this reference architecture and say, imagine your head application living agnostic to any of these platform and capability providers. But what you also need is this layer of abstraction. Without a layer of abstraction, you get into point-to-point integration, and then you're invariably going to find yourself with that vendor lock-in where your business is now tightly coupled with your tech stack. So where it makes sense, static portion of your apps can work directly by integrating with the likes of a CMS, a DAM, and those kind of products. But when you think like e-commerce or product information or merchandising information, something that is a little bit more dynamic in nature, you want to have some layer of abstraction built in. So when you buy into this reference architecture, right, this I can then map to what exists in Netlify as a product suite. So up at the top, when you're looking at your head application, right, you want that to be deployed, at the edge, leveraging CD and cache. We do all of that for you. But the abstraction layer is something that is very unique to us, right? We offer you two things: extensibility with Netlify extensions, and then Netlify Connect. That's basically our GraphQL that allows you to avoid issues around rate limits and underfetching and overfetching and things like that, but also gives you a way to define UI-based data models that are agnostic, and you're not tightly coupling your UI with data models that come from these platform providers without standing up additional infrastructure, whether that's, AKS or EKS or anything else you would do with a traditional, cloud provider. So with Netlify, what you're really doing is you're getting all of this, even APIs with security, you're getting everything powered at the edge and, with the caching layer, with the ability to build and deploy this without having to manage any infrastructure. So with that, I'm going to kind of jump ahead and say, well, if we're thinking about Sitecore and we're thinking about modernizing, what are the options in front of us? So there are three options, which is to say, well, if I'm on XP and I love XP and I want to do anything, well, then great, right? And to be honest, headless development, this Sitecore user group is probably not for you, right? Because you're doing great. But maybe you are an XP customer and you are thinking headless. So that is that option number two, where you want to have that content management backend, but now you can decouple your content delivery and leverage something like Netlify to build with those modern frameworks and deploy and leverage that modern compute. And then the third option is obviously where Sitecore and Netlify work really well together, because there's no other infrastructure blocking you. You don't have to manage or host any infrastructure. All you have to do is manage your app and application code. And Sitecore provides, the backend for front end, and then Netlify is just doing its thing and hosting it very seamlessly for you. So I'm going to take the option number 3 and expand into that a little bit more. So when you're thinking about Netlify or Sitecore XM Cloud, again, going back to that thing about automation, right? So if you're thinking about automation, this is typically what we do today with XP. You write your MVC application, you then have to kind of figure out your content deployment versus your configs versus your build deployment. And then you're always striving for that blue-green that really hasn't happened really for many clients because of the complexity, right? If it was just, a build with just a bunch of files, sure, you can achieve blue-green much faster. But this thing about managing indexes or, with code and configuration with content serialization, it's become nearly impossible to achieve perfect blue-green. So what are the chances that you really are able to give zero downtime deployments at a very cost-effective way without full hot, cold sort of environments where you're, paying twice as much so you can have zero downtime deployments because you have 2 production environments running. But then eventually when you deploy, let's say you're doing IaaS or PaaS or AKS or something like that, you still are doing content management and content delivery, and then you are still deploying an app that works with experienced editor versus something that is just, you know, your rendering host. So what we're saying is, with as you're thinking about headless, you're building your Next.js application and you're taking parts of your existing app and you're starting to convert it. You take that middle box and immediately eliminate that with Netlify. And then the last box also kind of splits and says, well, for content delivery, you use Netlify, and then Sitecore can provide the editing host. This is what exists today. There's no reason why you can't have your editing host also be part of Netlify, and not have to rely on Sitecore to host your editing host. But this kind of, again, simplifies the whole process of managing and building and releasing when you're thinking of headless development. Now, I want to go back to that box number 2 to say, well, there is still hope for XP, right? There's no reason why you can't do headless with XP. Maybe you're working on some microsites. Maybe you're working on a corporate site. Maybe you're still looking to modernize, because what you can do with JSS with XM Cloud, you can just as well do it with XP. So in that case, I'm going to just look at the top portion of content delivery and say, well, in order to simplify that, all we're saying is, let's say you have scaled your content delivery and you have load balance instances. On an average, you have 2 to 4 to maybe even up to 10, or even, you know, Comcast, I don't know, had like 90 plus servers in content delivery at one point. So you're trying to cut down all your content delivery costs and all that infrastructure to say, okay, all I have is content management with one content delivery, and Netlify comes in, provides CI/CD, and then you can push everything to Netlify core, and that now becomes your hosting provider. But your editing host can also be on Netlify, so you don't have to do any editing on traditional infrastructure anymore. So there is a path to doing this, right? So option number 2 and option number 3, whether you're an XP going headless, whether you're going with XM Cloud, if you're doing GSS, Netlify can really streamline that whole process for you. Now, there are more things you should think about and know, and these are things that were even new to me, like even a couple of years ago, right? Netlify shows up, Vercel shows up, and Sitecore is changing the way they're talking about how do you size up how much of the platform do you need, because it's SaaS. SaaS parameters different than, you know, when you get a license and you're just figuring out how much Azure or AWS is going to cost me. But when you think about something like a front-end cloud, you should think about 3 buckets in which you're trying to size up how much of the platform you need. But one good thing about something like Netlify is that invariably choosing Netlify is going to reduce your total cost of ownership of running Sitecore. It can cut it in half. It can even cut it by 2/3 in some cases, maybe even more. We've seen ROI of about 80% reduction in cost, because you just had too much infrastructure powering Sitecore. But the first part there is thinking about infrastructure. This is where you will build and deploy it, the final, this is where you actually deploy the final app or the site. And in there, you want to think about things like high performance edge, private connectivity. I mean, functions are built in, but whether or not you need private connectivity, and then high performance edge is just default for enterprises. Non-enterprises can probably run it on standard edge, but for enterprises, you want to think about high performance edge. Now, you've provisioned that infrastructure, you only have to do it once. Then now you're thinking about how much usage. This goes back to how much traffic are you moving to a platform like Netlify. It's kind of similar to what Sitecore says, you know, well, how many visitors do you have? No longer thinking about how many production instances or non-prod instances, but you're thinking about, you know, how much usage, right? So it's sort of pay per use. And that's where you really see also the TCO. And in here, you're thinking about bandwidth. You're thinking about number of web requests. You're thinking about edge functions, in addition to, you know, serverless compute. And then workflows are all about people. Well, how many users of the platform are you going to bring to Netlify, where you're going to manage these builds, where you're going to manage these deployments and security and all that other stuff? And in there, as you're building, because now you're not using, you know, Jenkins and Bamboo or anything else, you're not running all that infrastructure and those servers. Basically, what you're doing now is counting build minutes. how long does it take for your build to complete? How many builds do you want to run in parallel? That's your concurrent builds. So you're starting to think of these things like build minutes, number of engineers, bandwidths, web requests. But what you get out of the box that you don't really have to size up for is backup and disaster recovery. That's baked into the product. You get deployment previews, basically a preview URL for every build that you deploy. Zero downtime rollbacks, right? WAF, built-in WAF for all your web requests. And of course, data privacy compliance, PCI, HIPAA, SOC. So Netlify gives you the hooks for all of that. So it's fully compliant from the get-go. So that kind of gives you some of the basics of thinking about modern compute, modernizing your workflows, your CI/CD process, because going from traditional to headless, really, it's a whole different way of thinking about building, maintaining, managing, deploying apps. So with this, I want to kind of talk about these 5 key components of our platform, and then I'll switch over to actually looking at the platform, and maybe we'll do like a quick deployment of XM Cloud, the basic skate park demo. We'll just do a quick deployment, hopefully here in the next few minutes. So the 5 key components of Netlify that I think everybody should know is sites, builds, connect, extension, and visual editor, right? The sites and builds is what we're going to look at here. It's just the bread and butter of what you will do is where do you manage your sites and how do the builds work? Now, connect, I kind of talked about earlier. That is that API layer. You can actually build and run APIs at the edge and cache some of that data in Netlify so you don't have a lot of requests down to those APIs. We have customers who are actually eliminating MuleSoft, right? Incredible cost, complexity, requires specialized skill, and they're recovering a lot of that ROI because they're moving a lot of that middleware to Netlify using Connect. And extensions is going to be very interesting because if you heard from Sitecore's talking about building a marketplace and providing a place where you can actually write your business extensions or your platform extensions adjacent to the platform without having to customize Sitecore itself, like making it truly, truly SaaS. This is the one place where you can actually build once and deploy many, as in you write one snippet of code and now you want to apply it to multiple sites, multiple web properties. It's a perfect place to build and host and deploy extensions. And we see both our tech partners and our customers building extensions. So you can actually build private extensions that are only for your team and for your business, or you can actually build public extensions, sort of this marketplace where anybody can use your extension. And lastly, we do have our own visual editor and it's fully headless. And what that means is if you're an e-commerce customer and you think of that PDP page and you say, a typical PDP page is going to have some content from a CMS, DAM serving image library or image gallery, a PIM serving product information, DAM, like imagery, and you have e-commerce giving you the pricing information and a few other things. Now, agnostic to any of the data sources, imagine a visual editor that takes any data source and makes any portion of the UI inline editable. So when we acquired StackBit, we got that was a very powerful headless page builder that can connect to any data source and make things editable. So this is, again, thinking headless, thinking all the things that are at your disposal. How do you come around to using how much of this is up to you? But for here, I'm going to show you just 1 and 2 real quick. So I'm going to try to stop sharing and share again. See if I can share my Netlify instance, which is not up. Okay, I'm gonna open a new browser here. All right. So share. Oops. Where is it? There we go. I think that's it. Yeah. Share. Oh, nope. Wrong stuff. Hold on. I share my Google Drive. Sorry, guys. Give me 1 second. share. Here we go. All right. Are you guys still with me? Do you have any questions thus far? Is this making sense? And I'm kind of going fast, but just want to make sure everybody's still on point.
I do have questions, but I would better leave them to the end of the presentation.
Sure. All right, cool. So I'm gonna start at the top, and if you go to app.netlify.com, you can sign up for this today. You don't, need to wait for your company or your your partner to have a special access. You can literally sign up for free, connect a code base, and get going. Right. So when you log into Netlify, one of the first things show you is that Netlify, we call this our team management or enterprise grid, where you can actually create organizations, and your organization can have a bunch of sites, actually a bunch of teams that then can have a bunch of sites. So you have the ability to, and in this case, we have like a Netlify go to market, org under which we do a bunch of demos, and we have general use cases and partner demos and sales demos. So, and here you can kind of, build a site, deploy a site, manage permissions, look at the usage, buy the team, buy the site, actually buy the team, and then at the org level. But outside of that, what I was showing you, the 5 things, right? Sites, builds, connect, extensions, and the visual editor. Everything else here is primarily for, administration, but these are the core features. So in a site, if you're looking to deploy a new site, I would just go here and say add a new site, and I would say import an existing project. And then one of the first things you see is, you know, where's your source control? Pick your favorite source control. We can deploy it from there. Now, this is important that with Netlify, you have Azure DevOps natively integrated. Vercel kind of offers this as well, but they work through an extension. For us, we have natively supported the 4, most popular source control providers. So I'm just going to go to GitHub, and I've already authorized, my Netlify starter kit, the Sitecore Foundation, GSS, Next.js Foundation source code. I just pulled it down, put it on my Git, and I authorized it. And I said, okay, let me use this, right? Now, if I use this, all I have to do is give it a site name, and I could say, headless, headless dev, dev sug. I'm going to check availability. Site is available. Great. In my base directory, I'm going to say this is where you'll find my base directory. It's going to populate a bunch of stuff. I got to add a few environment variables. These, so there's 2 ways to do this. In this UI, you kind of enter them individually, but there's another UI where you can just go and dump like an environment file, and it picks up all your environment variables. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy a few variables that are important for this demo. So we need the API key. Hopefully won't take too long. I'm gonna also get the site name. Oops. And of course we have like some kind of typo in there, but that's how we set it up. Oh well. And then we'll do the GraphQL endpoint. Right. And my endpoint is pretty standard. And let's see, I need my edge context ID, and that should do it. So if I do this, and then I need this guy. So if I do this, and all I have to do is hit deploy, it's going to do a bunch of things. And hopefully when it's done, we have our skate park demo up and running. So while this is happening, it says deployment in progress, right? You can go in and check out where the deployment is and what it's doing. It's going to give you all the details about what it's doing behind the scenes. But while it's doing that, we'll come back to it, but I want to kind of show you a deployment that I already did earlier today. And what I'll show you in there is this headless site. And what I did was, so this, I'm going to open this up and you can see, hopefully this loads, and this is our SUG. Sorry, my internet is really bad. So what I did was I just put a little note in here. Welcome to ADL SUG. This is actually for the Atlanta SUG. But I'm showing you that because what I did here was I basically mapped my main branch to trigger deployments. But I can also trigger branch deployments. So what I actually did here was trigger my feature branch to also deploy. So what I can now have is, and I also configured a webhook. So for all of my commits, the builds are automatically triggered. So if I actually, let me go to my builds that are already complete. So I'll just go back to deploys, right? And if I go and deploy it, so I've had all of these deployments done. If I go to my production, I did like a test commit, right? This is my Atlanta SUG. But if I do my feature that I committed, right, that should say, you know, it's got its feature updates. So basically what this shows you is that you get a preview URL for every build that you're deploying, right? So what I was mentioning earlier is just you get infinite environments and you can use any of these for testing and rollbacks. And one other cool feature I wanted to show you was, you know, if a build fails, there's a cool feature in Netlify where you can just ask it, why did it fail, right? And it uses generative AI to look at what was in the logs. You don't have to dig through the logs to uncover where the error was, which file, and what happened. And in here, you know, I updated my Next.js version, didn't update my package. So it just tells me, hey, verify that your Next.js version matches what this guy is expecting. So if I go back and it gives me also options to resolve it. So this really cool thing, why did it fail, kind of saves you a lot of time in that. But let's see if our site is done. Because that's just basic build and deploy. Like there's so many more settings in here, but I just wanted to quickly kind of cover those two things just to say, well, once you set up your site, right, and you configure a webhook and you map your, actually, let me go here, and you map your branch to deployment, you absolutely don't need to worry about anything else. And as you're checking in and as you're doing your pull requests and as you're committing, builds can keep triggering and keep happening. And that concurrent builds also kind of helps you deploy, you know, up to 5, up to 10, however many concurrent builds you want to process, you can kind of scale that accordingly. So let's see if our site actually deployed. Where am I at? Sites, and this is my not yet deployed, so still deploying. All right, let's see, unless it failed. Let's see, deploys. Oh, failed due to plugin error. Okay, what is my plugin error? That's interesting. Base directory, please check your build settings. Okay, I didn't configure my site correctly somewhere. Let me check. Okay, so during the demo, we created the headless dev SUG site, and as we were demoing it, um, I think the deploy originally failed, and here's where you can see that production deploy that failed that says failed due to plugin error. And I think as we were going to the Q&A, I went in and looked at it and fixed it behind the scenes, but I wanted to make sure that you all got to see what the fix was. And of course, I used the awesome feature here that says, why did it fail? And instead of going through all of the logs and trying to figure out what actually happened, I'm just going to click here to say, you know, it was a simple boo-boo where I didn't update the publish directory with .next at the very end. So if I go into site configuration and I look at my build and deploy settings, here I had just pasted the base directory and it had copied
the base directory into the published directory, and basically the error says, well, they can't be the same. So I needed to put a /.next. So when I did that and I redeployed, it obviously kind of was successful. And now if you click on the production deployed or the deployed instance, and there you go, the escape harp side actually works. So just wanted to make sure you all got to see that minor thing with troubleshooting with Netlify, but also the demo finally worked. Thank you.
So I have two questions.
Sure.
The first one is actually yes, no question, and another is more open. So the yes, no question is, does Netlify support log drainage? And
Yes, it does.
okay,
100%.
yeah, okay, that's what we need always to use with external monitoring tool. You mentioned that you can actually manage overfetching and catch that. Can you say more about this mechanism?
Yes. So
This is very crucial for experience edge. We have a limit.
yeah. So what we do with Netlify Connect is that you can basically provide any endpoint. So let me actually show you a visual of this. Maybe it's easier to understand how Connect actually works. So file. No, that's not it. Hold on 1 second. So I'm going to show you a visual of how to imagine what Connect is and what it actually does. So I'm going to share my screen again. Where is my Zoom? Here. Share. And I'm share this. So the way Netlify Connect works is that you have a bunch of sites that you deploy, right? But you have like these data layers that you can configure. So connector is basically a group of data layers, and each data layer is basically a group of data sources. So if you have APIs, you want to chain APIs, you can totally do that. Or if you have any other, like a database or any other data source, right, you can pull that in. And for each data source, as you're building the data layer, you get to do two things, right? You get to specify a model, right? Basically, it's TypeScript. You write out a model, and then you get another function for data sync to say how you want to do your initial data sync versus incremental data sync. And when you're done with it, you basically get a GraphQL sandbox. And what you're trying to do is for all the requests. So let's say you have an endpoint. I'm just gonna say, maybe you have, I don't know, Sitecore search API endpoint, right? Where you're gonna run all your queries. So if there's a rate limit on that, basically for each one of those queries, if you pull that into Netlify Connect, it's basically an ephemeral sort of data layer where it caches that data. So the next request that comes in doesn't make that API call down to Sitecore Search or Sitecore XM Cloud, so long as that data is cached in Netlify. And that's where you're seeing all of this stuff, right? So for every one of these data layers, you get an endpoint and a webhook. And then you get some way to secure it, some level of API management with API security. And you can also have custom webhooks to trigger refreshing that data or updating that data. But then behind that data layer, you can pull in any of these other data sources. So imagine again that PDP page, right? Imagine a PIM, a CMS, and an e-commerce coming together to create a catalog data layer that unifies multiple APIs and aggregates all their data, pulls it into Netlify Connect to where now you query against Netlify's GraphQL. So the next request for a PDP doesn't trigger an API request to either the PIM or the e-commerce or the CMS, right? So does that answer your question, Martin?
I was muted, sorry. Does it also let you do some data validation against the schema, something like Zod does for TypeScript?
That's a good point. I haven't dug that far, but I can follow up on that for you. And I can get you in touch with our solution engineering team. They can also kind of dive in deeper. But I believe we have data validations because we just did one for a customer, and I believe we're able to validate that both incremental sync and the actual accuracy of the schema, and if we're getting the right data from the APIs. But don't hold me to it.
Thank you, Varun.
Cool.
Any more questions from the audience, maybe?
Yeah, I have a
Okay.
quick question, Varun. Hey,
Sure.
Martin. Yeah, you mentioned high performance edge,
Mhm.
right? Can you talk a little bit about that versus, normal edge?
Yeah. For our non-enterprise customers, we have our standard edge that is deployed in clusters that are just like shared across the entire install base. For high performance edge, we actually stand up Kubernetes containers and dedicated edge at the same POPs for that customer. So you get higher compute that powers that edge. So it's gonna be orders of magnitude faster, at least a few orders, than what the standard edge is, right? And for the most part, standard edge is great, right? It serves the purpose of most sites. But when you have true enterprises, especially e-commerce, and you have millions of visitors, and you need that true, global scale with real performance. Actually, we're announcing another really awesome feature. We'll be supporting AGA as well, AWS's global accelerator, that will further add to the performance of our high performance edge. I know that's not the most technical answer. If you're looking for the most technical answer, I can kind of pull that for you as well. But
No,
it's
I
basically
haven't
more dedicated compute for high performance edge. It's just higher compute.
understood. I just haven't heard of multiple levels of edge caching, so that's interesting. Thank you.
Cool.
Varun, I have one question.
Thanks.
I looked at the Netlify
Sure.
Connect data sources you're talking about. Can the data
Uh-huh.
source live on premise and needs to connect via VPN or something?
Yes, that should also work. From what I understand, yes. What I would also look at is some level of private connectivity that is going to allow for that static IP for you to be able to integrate. But my understanding is yes, right?
Oh
We
yeah,
should be able
that's
to connect
great.
data
Yeah,
sources.
because that's a limitation right now we're seeing with other providers. So it's great that's available. Nice.
Yeah. Again, I can double check that for you as well, Cortelia. Let me make sure we get the most official answers for you
Sure.
guys. So yeah.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
Well, what would you call as the most common challenges you have observed with integrating Netlify and specifically XM Cloud, and how these are addressed? Just out of your mind, of course.
I mean, challenges with like XM Cloud or with Netlify, or generally developers trying
These two
to
together.
build it out. Well, I
These two
think
playing together.
yeah. So we have really come a long way in how we support Next.js. If you asked me, 9 months ago, Netlify wasn't at par with our competition even in how we were supporting Next.js, but today things are just like we're like almost really at par where, however you build with Next.js, we have almost the same parity. There is one issue that we also kind of solved with experience editor support. There's I think a pull request for that pending, and we're working with a Sitecore team to make sure that experience editor works flawlessly with Netlify. But you're not going to see that issue with XM Cloud anyway. That's more of an XP thing. So outside of that, I don't know if there's like any real issues or risks that I've uncovered. The only thing I would say is, watch out for how long your builds are. Yeah, we've seen customers that are, running builds for like hours, and how do you get high performance builds? So that's an option to even Like if you have a really sizable site and you're generating a lot of static pages and it's taking even hours to do it, we can basically up you into high performance build, and that brings it down to like minutes, right? But kind of getting ahead of some of that initially as you're kind of doing the migration. Later on, it should just be flawless.
Thank you, Varun. Last chance for the audience to ask the question. Anyone from the visitors? You got any questions?
All right. Well,
All
if there are
right,
more
thank you very much,
questions,
Varun.
feel free to reach out. I can answer them, but this was awesome. Thank you for having me. And I got to drop, unfortunately. Sorry, we're going to miss you thing, but I'm going to watch the recording. So,
Well, we'll try and go quick so we're not keeping everybody for super long time on this one. But we'll see how far we get through. Okay, so building a head application in Go. Just a quick intro about me. I'm a solutions architect at Sitecore. I work in the sales engineering team these days. I'm previously a 7-time technology MVP. Been around Sitecore for a very long time. So if you see me in the community, you'll see me as Guitar Rich on Slack. Please feel free to hit me up and ask any questions around. What we'll do today is we're going to look at focusing on metadata editing. Really, like the whole Go thing is just a fun exercise in seeing what we can do with it. But ultimately, it is we're talking about metadata editing, what it is, what it enables, why you want to make use of it, as it speaks to XM Cloud. Okay, so and I'll fly through these slides a little bit quicker so we can get to the fun parts. So there's two types of editing you may have heard now. You've got Chrome's editing and you've got metadata editing. Chrome's editing is historically how we used to do it. You can see from this architecture diagram, it's pretty complicated, but effectively the way that this works with headless applications, and this is kind of how your DXP platform is going to still do it, XMXP, when they're headless, are going to work like this. So with, let me just click that button to get out of the way. What happens is when you go into Experience Editor, it's going to make a request out to your CM to ask for the data for the page to be rendered. It's going to run through all of the editing middleware. You can see here it's going through a lot of different services. Ultimately, there's a lot of trips backwards and forwards from pages or Experience Editor into the CM, from the CM into the rendering host, from the rendering host backwards, from the editing stuff into the rendering host. So there's a lot of moving parts as we go through. It has to do a lot. This editing data disk cache is quite awkward. What this means is that we built this for Next.js. We built it for Angular and Vue and React as well in the SDKs, although we didn't build some other feature support that works with XM Cloud into those. We really focused on getting Next.js to be a first-class citizen of XM Cloud, and there's a lot of support that goes into the head application because of how editing works to support all of this. So product team went away and they re-architected this into metadata editing. And I think you can see straight away that this architecture is much more simple than the Chrome's data editing. Okay, so now Pages is going to make a call directly to your editing host, to the Next.js application, or we'll see later, any application that is running your web application. There's a couple of APIs that are implemented. There's under this API in editing, it's going to ask for the rendered view of the page. It's going to pass some information to it to say what the item ID is, what the language is, what the version is, number of different options there. The editing render middleware is then going to validate that we've got a good request. We want to make sure that we're coming from Pages and not coming from a bad actor. It's going to put, in our case, when we're looking at Next.js, it puts Next.js into preview mode, which enables then, instead of statically generating the page, it will effectively server-side render that page. And Then it redirects to that page route. The page route then goes and gets the data from the page props factory. Obviously, we're putting it in preview mode, so it knows that it needs to go and get it from the preview edge endpoint, and then it pulls that from XM and then returns it out to pages. It's a much more simple process, and it is a lot quicker. And the benefits of this really are, like we said, the architecture is just simpler. Because of that, you'll notice if you've used a JSS 21.2 or higher application in pages, editing and moving around in the pages is a lot faster. So we've improved the rendering time for pages in editing. Because that iframe now points directly to the rendering host, you may have seen previously you had to jump through some hoops to get relative paths working in pages and in Experience Editor, and when you're running locally in Docker and things like that, you would have to have different settings for the allow server URL in media URLs to get relative paths work. Sometimes we had to set the public URL to an empty string just to get it to work. Things like that. It was a little awkward, but now with this, those relative paths work much better. And then the other thing it enables is because now we have a focus on pages. So one of the side effects this does have, it means that Experience Editor will not work once you've enabled metadata editing. There is a workaround that we have in place that you can use for now if you want to use Experience Editor while still retaining some of that metadata editing information, but it does mean your performance suffers a little bit. So if you want to get the full speed of pages, then we can get rid of that little bit of code in the starter kit, and your full pages, you can then get all of the performance that metadata editing allows. And that means also then that we can iterate really quick with getting future updates out to pages, and we don't have to fight with working through an older, much more complicated legacy architecture with the way that Chrome's editing works. The other really cool thing about it is that it enables your pages instance to attach itself to any rendering host target. So we can host our editing host anywhere very simply, and you'll have seen that in the changelog there was an update to pages. You can now click the button to change your editing host, so you don't have to go into content editor and go down through the system items to change that out. What it means, if the browser can see an editing host, you can use it in pages. So now that means that we can run a local editing host just running on port 3000, and pages will now work against a locally running instance of your head application. No need to run Docker. And you don't have to go through the whole fun process of setting a local storage variable and making sure the Docker's all running. It just works, and it's really nice. This also works if you saw my session at Symposium where we talked about running in code spaces. Same thing there. We can just run our whole development environment in code spaces, and now pages can just connect that up to it just sees that, so you can connect pages up to it, and you'll be able to edit your code base or your content, sorry, while you're running locally. Okay, so that's a lot of good benefits for everybody running the Next.js kit. But what it also means is that because Chrome's had a lot of reliance on things that were in the starter kit for Next.js, because we're not relying on that so much anymore, it means it's much easier to build starter kits in other frameworks. And you'll see we've already released an update to that Angular framework that's in beta now. You can go and play with that. The Netcore framework is currently also in beta. That's, I know Rob Earlham's working on that to get that to support metadata editing and take advantage of all that good stuff. So it allows us to build starter kits in other frameworks. We're no longer really isolated down that Next.js path. And that's not to say that Next.js isn't a fantastic option. It's always been a great option. That's why we went down that route in the first place. But it means we can have fun with some other stuff. So that's what we're going to do for the rest of our presentation. We're going to look at some production ready code, honest. All right, I'm just going to end this show here. And we will dig into this. Let me see. All right. Can everybody still see my screen? We've got that up here.
Yep.
Okay, great. What we're looking at here is we built these demos for Symposium. They're a nice demo to work with because it's got a couple of different components, and we can just kind of display how we would build this in a different application. What I'm going to do is switch over to my code here. I've already created some code for you. I don't want to go through the whole thing from the start. Is this big enough? Can everybody see it okay, or do I need to zoom in a bit more?
It's pretty fine. We can read it.
All right. Okay. So I'm not going to teach you all how to code in Go right now. I'm just going to take you through the concepts of it. And you'll see it's a pretty straightforward language. And there's some fairly straightforward concepts as we go through this. And we should see that what we've got right now is just a head application. It's a standard application. It's going to read from Experience Edge and pull the content in and display that content on the page. As of yet, it doesn't support metadata editing, and we're going to add that in this session. Okay, so a Go application starts with a main entry point. In our case here, what we're doing here is setting up the web server. So I'm using Labstack's Echo web server to configure that out. Very simple. We just create a new web server. I'm configuring where my static files live. I'm adding gzip for performance. We're adding some middleware logging. I'll come back to this point in a minute. And then all you do for this server is you tell it what the option is, what the request type is going to be, whether it's a get or a post or a put, what the path is, and then where the code is, what the object is, or the function is that's going to handle that request coming through. Finally, I'm setting up here just some concurrency on the servers to make sure that it supports scaling, and then we go and get our port from the environment variables. I'm doing that because I hosted this on Heroku, and I'll show you that in a bit as well, just how easy it is to host this stuff. So this is how they set the port up, and then I'm starting the server. If it errors, we'll log in a fatal error and exiting out. But that is the entry point for our service. A little bit different to Netcore or .NET, but very similar. If you've done any node development, you'll recognize this kind of setup. One of the things that I'm also using is a templating language in Go called Temple, and it's just TEMPL. And what that allows us to do is we can write, it's kind of the Go equivalent of JSX or TSX. We can write HTML in our temple files, and there's a translation thing, kind of like a Go equivalent of Webpack. It's going to convert these temple files into Go files. So I'll show you here. This is my base template. It's just got my body, head. It's got some extra information in here. If I look at the generated code here, you can see that there's a lot more information into it. That would be ugly to work with. So templating is really nice. And we can do a lot with templating. So this is structured very similar to a JSS site. I've got my base template here. I've got my main layout. My main layout is going to render 3 placeholders. And it's I based this off the SXA starter kit. Okay. I can have my components. I've got atoms in here in case I want to reuse things. I've also configured this site to work with Tailwind. So you can see I've got my Tailwind config here. It goes and looks at the HTML that's in the temple files to pick up what classes are being used. And because this is SXA, we've got some safe list options in there. You can pretty much ignore the rest of it. This is just purely to get our color system in that we used for the demos, and some extra bits in there that we wanted to have. But it's other than that, it's a very basic Tailwind configuration. In the CSS, I have my global source where I import the Tailwind things, and I set some extra CSS parameters. Now, here what I have is there is some extra CSS that you need to have when Pages is in edit mode. This just makes sure that some of the editing chromes that are added to the page are hidden away from the user, because you don't want to see them. But there is a number of HTML elements that are added to the page, and we'll go into that a little bit later. So this just hides them all out there. You can see this if you go and look at a page in Pages. You'll be able to see the CSS that it adds in. That's actually part of the starter kit rather than being Pages adding it in. So that's why I've added it in here. I've created some models. Go is a strongly typed language, so we need to create some models. These models really just represent the GraphQL response that is coming from Experience Edge. I'm not going to dig deep into it because there's just a lot of it here. If you've looked at the GraphQL response that comes from Experience Edge, you'll know that it can be a little complex. This just builds all of that out. One of the things I did want to highlight, though, is when we enable metadata editing, and we'll show you this in a bit, you get some extra information when you are editing the page, and that's this metadata information. So the metadata information gives you a field title, a field ID, and what the type is, and then the raw value of the field. That information is rendered out to the page in the editing chromes, and then Pages will take that information and use it to be able to overlay the editing user interface on top of it. Okay, and then finally we Sitecore it up. So again, I wrote this kind of in a Sitecore type of way. So if you've looked at XP and XM, it will be familiar to people as they go through. So we have our request begin pipeline, which comes through on our handler here. We go through and just check, is it the sitemap? If it is, we're going to handle that differently. Otherwise, we'll handle the page. If the page returns are not found, then we'll go and check for some redirects. If the redirects don't work, eventually we'll just send it to the not found handler. We can do more with this, but for now, this is all I wanted to get added in. There's one more option that we have to do, is handling dynamic placeholders. So when dynamic placeholders get returned in Experience Edge, they get returned as the placeholder key with the star on there. JSS actually has some code that goes in and updates those objects with the number that matches where they should go in the layout response. Okay, so we have to do that in the head application also. All right, so the one final thing before we dig into how we handle the page here is I'm just adding a little redirect in here for /media. You'll see that if you look at the next config, it's got some redirects in there. This is purely for edit mode because you don't have these paths in production. And this will redirect any media items through to the CM, to the API host. Okay, that allows us to see the images when we're editing it. So the page handler, again, none of this is particularly complicated. What we're doing here in the page handler, we're going and getting our request. So we get the path for the URL, and we're going to pass that in and build a layout query. If we look here on edge queries, I've just got some functions here that build my edge queries. So the layout query returns the layout. We pass in the site, the route path, and the language. So if you've done that in the GraphQL Playground, This is exactly the kind of thing that we'll write in there. This is the same query that JSS writes. And once that has been executed, run query with parameters, this goes and executes that query and returns as an object. We marshal it into JSON and then effectively transform that into our layout response object. And then we pass that through to the main layout. Now, you'll notice that the main layout here is just rendering these placeholders. So if we go to the functions here, again, this is just some templating. But what it's doing is we're looping through all of the components in each placeholder. The way that the data is structured is you can start with the top placeholders, loop through the placeholders, and then each placeholder has a set of components that are added to it. You can loop through them, add the components to the page at the time. If the component has another placeholder in, you just do the same thing and you just loop through all the way through. You traverse through the JSON object until the page is rendered. And it's very, very similar to, actually, this is more similar to even how MVC does it. The Netcore host does very similar to this as well, albeit with a razor view instead of a template. It's not easy to say. We have some helpers here, which build out the components. We've got some inbuilt components like placeholder and dynamic placeholders. And then things like our fields here. We're just doing this to get the data out of the JSON, out of the object, and make sure that it renders to the page okay. So these are the equivalent of the JSS rich text or the JSS image components that you get in Next.js. All right. So you've kind of got the outline there of a Go application. So what we'll do now is, let me put this. I'm going to go over here. With Go, we run the application using a tool called Air. It runs the application and puts watches on it so that you get live reloading. And if I go to the web browser, we can see that it pops up. And you can see that I just ran that. Goes very fast. That's not a pre-cached version. I'll just zoom in a bit. There we go. So that wasn't pre-cached. That is just running on port 3000. You can see it started when I ran that air command here. It's pretty quick at building up things. So if I go through the pages, we can see that it loads that data pretty quickly indeed. If you have cached data in this application, in my testing, I'm getting time to first byte of around 30 to 40 milliseconds. If it needs to hit experience edge, then it takes a lot longer because the edge query just takes longer. But I'm generally, even on uncached, we're getting under 250 milliseconds. Unless the edge query is not cached, and then that can take a second because edge just is taking a second to return. All right. So let's pause that. And we'll go back over to our code window here, and I'm going to check out this branch here, add editing. So any questions so far?
That's impressive. I was just about to ask, how about editing experience?
Yeah. All right. So let's go into that. I don't know that we'll get to full-on HTMX here because actually we don't need HTMX to enable the editing experience. The HTMX part is going to come when we start building components that the user will interact with on the website. But we'll kind of go into how that's also set up here. Okay, so
just want to say thank you for explaining the metadata editing. And
yeah, no problem.
Chrome, because that's like no way explained, and here was the full...
Well, we're going to dig into it. All of this here is not fully documented yet. Like the approach as to how we enabled it or what it puts on is documented, but we're working on documentation as like a step-by-step how to build your own, right? We want you to be able to build your own, but this is what we're going to go through now on how to build your own. So First thing we need to do is you'll notice that we've added a few more routes to our main web server. So I've registered some API endpoints, and this is editing config and editing render. This first one here, when we've added a route for options on editing config. It seems that I was just working on this today, and it seems like a recent update to either Chrome or something has made us require the access control headers on the pre-flight request as well as the standard request. Previously, we only added them to the standard request, but now because I need to add them to the pre-flight request, I've just added the extra handler in here. Okay, so when we're editing, it's going to go into this config function. You see, I've added some editing middleware in my Go application. So my handler for config is here. Config is pretty simple. All it needs to do is you need the config API to tell pages what components you have in your application and that your editing mode is now metadata. There's a third object in the JSON called packages. I don't think it's used, or at least nobody could tell me what it's used for. In Next.js, it returns a list of the JSS packages that are in use. For us, well, I'm just returning an empty array, and it works fine. So what we're doing here is editing middleware config. We're checking that the allowed origins is correct. So we don't want this to return if it's just some other random thing trying to get access to us. So we check out allowed origins. This should really just be pages. There's an environment variable for this as well. So if we're working in our staging environments, we can change URLs and things like that. We also check our editing secret. So the editing secret is passed on the query string, but we want to make sure that matches what we have in our environment variable. If otherwise, it's going to return a forbidden. And then we set our content security policy. So setting our content security policy, here we're getting our allowed origins. So it should be, again, pages.sitecorecloud.io. We're setting that in our frame ancestors. And we're also setting that, where is it here? You can see the access control methods here. Okay. So if we go back here, now we're just building all of those lists together. Components that get components. Oh, I didn't go into that earlier. So let me go into that in a second. No, you know what? I'll do it here. One of the things I meant to go back and show you was this components register components. So if we go here, this is the component factory from JSS effectively. It's not quite as neat as JSS. I didn't build a automated thing that goes and figures out all of your components for you. We could probably build that and get it to auto-generate, but for now I just hand-coded this. So you register your component with a name. The name has to match what is the name of the component, the rendering item in Sitecore. And then that is your template that matches your component. Okay. So when we register the component, we can see that we're just storing it in a big array for the application. And then when we get the component, it takes the name of the component in from the request and goes and finds it in the array. If it's not found, it'll just return you a raw string saying, I don't know what this is. Otherwise, it will return that out and return the function that can then render that component. This is just a little Go templating thing. We also treat partial design dynamic placeholder a little bit differently, just because of how that dynamic placeholder works within partial designs. So we have to render that slightly differently, and it's mostly down to the chromes that we add around it. And we'll get into that when we talk more about editing. So in config here, when I'm doing get components, I'm just going, it is literally just returning me that array. So it returns me the array, and then we transform that into an object, and then return it as JSON. So if we go here, what you can see is if we do API/editing/config, I've got the, oh, did I stopped it, didn't I? There we go. You run it again. All right, so you can see here, here's my JSON object, and it returns edit mode is metadata. If it doesn't return metadata, then Pages puts itself in Chrome's editing mode. All right. Second part to this is our render method. So our render method, Pages calls config. It returns back that it's in metadata editing. It then calls the render API, passes the item ID, the language, the version, and a number of other things that I'll show you now. And that render method sets internally, well, on Next.js, it kind of sets an internal set of parameters that Next.js knows that it's going to have to render that in preview mode. For us, in Go, I'm actually just passing those on to the next request. So you'll see as we come in here in the middleware start, we do the same checks, check the allowed origins, check the editing secret, and making sure that there's no bad actors getting in here. And then we're pulling these parameters off. So site, item ID, language, route, and mode. And then just some messing around with the parameters. We're checking that none of them are missing. And then we're setting this preview data object. And finally, we do a redirect with the status found. So it's a 307 response code. And we redirect to the route path, but we're passing in all of this information to that route for me as well. I'm doing that because Go is a little bit different. Well, because it's server side rather than Edge and the way Next works. We need to store the state somehow, so we're just passing it on the query string. It's the easiest way to pass the state through and make sure we're working that way around, rather than having to do a whole session thing. So what that means is now when we go back to our pipelines and we look at request begin and we go to our page handler, this has now changed considerably. Instead of just rendering the page out, first of all, we're checking the edit mode. So if there's a mode on the query string and it's called edit, we're going to put the whole thing into edit mode. We make a different query to get the data than we do if we're getting the data for just page mode. And I'll show you that query in a second. We're passing in all of this information to that query, and eventually we're returning it. But then we just push that through to the main layout again in the same way that we did previously. The query is the bit that gives it a little bit of extra. We tell Edge to give us the metadata information. So if we go to the query here, you'll see now we're using an editing query. We're still getting the rendered view of the path. We're also getting the dictionary information here, but we're not calling layout. So if you look at the layout query here, we're calling layout rather than item directly. Okay, so in the editing query, we're calling item and asking for the rendered view, and we're passing the path, the language, and version in on the item. One of the other things that we're doing here is when I go to where I go back here, is we're passing through 2 extra headers on the Edge request. First of all, we're saying edit mode is true, and then we're setting layout kind. I don't know exactly what these options are for, but I do know internally. Let me just go back here. What they do is they tell Experience Edge to include the metadata tags with the fields. If you don't have these 2 headers, then it will just return it in Chrome's edit mode. And it took me a while to figure that out. They haven't been documented yet. They have now. Recorded for everybody to know. So we're running that. This also allows you to build your dictionary. So in edit mode, you want to get your whole dictionary. There's some extra queries that you can paginate through your dictionary if you need to. But now that has given us all of our information. We pass it through to the main layout. The final part of the puzzle is we have to add editing chromes to our fields. So if I go to my helper functions here for my fields, I go to my rich text field. You see I can render my rich text, but what I'm doing it is I'm returning it through a field metadata renderer. And if I go to that, let's go to the actual template here. This is adding in my editing chromes. So if it's in edit mode, I know that because my field ID is populated. I'm adding in a before Chrome, where we're telling it it's a text Sitecore, where the Chrome type is a field. We have to have these classes on. This CSS class, by the way, that just hides it from the view. We're adding in all of the raw data from the metadata, so that information that I showed you earlier from that metadata object, the data source, the title, the field ID, field name, raw value, and the data source you can see here is just the ID language revision of version. That information just gets put straight inside these code tags as raw JSON. Again, they're hidden from the user, but pages will pick those up and use that information then to overlay the editing information. And then this just tells it where the end of the field is. We have the same thing happening for placeholders. We have to have a little bit of different Chrome on placeholders. So if I go to the placeholder Chrome here, this is just a little hacky thing. If you are the top level placeholder, it still needs an ID. That ID needs to be just as an empty GUID, effectively. There's probably a much nicer way of doing this in Go, but I am not a very good Go programmer. I learned Go as I was writing this, so there's probably better ways to do everything than I've done it, but it works really nicely. We're adding the Chrome again. A little bit of different Chrome, so our Chrome type is a placeholder this time, and we also have an ID, which is different, and we're setting a cursor style, which is different. The closing one, the only thing really that is different is this placeholder Chrome type, and then our partial dynamic placeholders, we're just rendering some extra information around for that. Okay. So when we render that out, that means that we're using that metadata to add the chromes before and after every component. What that means we can do is we see on our local host here, our application is still going to render just fine. And if we inspect it, you'll see that it's just standard HTML here. It's just very fast at rendering it. And then if we go into pages though, let me refresh the page, make sure that I'm not timed out. So this is loading it still from the default editing code. So that's our Next.js application that is running in XM Cloud. And, you can go through the pages like this and and see it. Now you'll see the difference because I have not implemented these components in the Go application. So when we change it, you'll see that it just says those components are not found. But if I change it from the default to my local host and I change it to 3000 here, now that's running my Go application, and you can kind of see I was pretty quick at loading it up. You see the components are not found. So if we change the pages, it's very fast at loading everything in, and we still get all of our editing features because it's picking up that information from the Chromes. We can go through, we can set our image and change our image if we want. I don't know whether it's going to let me log into it. Well, that's an interesting error. I can go and change my text. Okay, and we can see that it's pages, so it just saves it as normal. There's no real difference in it. So very quickly, we now have a Go application that is running metadata editing. It's running, I can edit everything in pages, and I just need to implement my components using my templating language. All right. One last thing that I wanted to show, because it was interesting when we saw things being built and deployed on Netlify. One of the nice things about Go is just, again, how easy it is to deploy. You know, we historically coming from a .NET background, right, and a more Windows-based development framework, things were quite complicated when we deployed that out. Netcore makes things a lot easier, but some of these other modern code bases and frameworks and languages make things even easier for deployment, and especially some of the modern hosts. So let's deploy our Go application. We're going to deploy it to Heroku because Heroku is pretty good at doing this. MC, give it a name. I'll create the app. It goes ahead and creates the app. I'm going to connect it to my GitHub repo, which is called Use Your Head. Oh, by the way, yeah, this I'll make this repo visible for everybody at the end. You'll be able to go and see the repo and go and have a look at the code. So I'll connect it to there. I won't deploy just yet. I want to go and set my environment variables. I'll reveal my config vars here. Now, Heroku can deploy a bunch of different options. It does pick up from your repo what its build pack should be for the most part. And I think, did I need one more? Let me just go and check. What did I need here? I just need the language, actually, yes. En, so I'll add that in. So it should pick up your build packs. I'm going to tell it that we're using Go, and I'm also going to tell it that we're using Node. So I'll add build pack goes Go, and I'll add Node. The reason I'm telling it we're using Node is for Tailwind. It runs an npm script for Tailwind to compile its CSS. And then I'll go to deploy, and I'll hit deploy branch, and it's going to go ahead and do that. We'll go over to activity. We'll view the build in progress. Kind of like Vercel, Netlify, this goes ahead and sets up the build for you. It does all of its DevOps that it needs. Right now, your first one's always going to take a little bit longer because it's having to download Go and install it in the different build packs. Next time, it's a lot faster, although as you'll see, it's pretty quick at doing this. If you haven't used Heroku, it's quite impressive as to how it all works. All right, so now it's deployed. I can go and copy my URL here. There's probably an easier way of doing this. I think there's a link somewhere, but I'll just copy it for now. And we'll go ahead and see that. See it's running on Heroku. As quick as that. And that's running on, where is it here? It does have processes. Let me refresh that. So this, you can see this is my instance, my server that it's running on. I can turn it off so I don't use up any money. Or I can change the dyno type. Right now I have it on basic, but if I want it working off a monster instance, I can do that, and I can go and edit it and say, hey, I want it running off 100 different instances. It'll cost me $3.40 an hour. So I probably don't want to do that, but it'll scale very well. You know, so even if I want it running on 2 and I hit confirm, and that's now running on those instances. It's very quick at doing it. And you can see as I go around here. Shall we do the, let's see whether it actually will do me, you know what, I should do this in incognito. Let's just run a quick lighthouse score. I actually didn't do this earlier, so I don't know what it's going to give me, but it should give me pretty fast scores. And a lot of it's just because Go is so fast at loading it up. But while it's running that, do we have any questions? Yeah, it's not too bad. With no performance optimization. And I think the worst of it is just because of that really big picture in the middle.
That's so impressive. You basically explained us the whole editing process,
Yeah.
just an example of an abstract language. That's
And the
helped us
nice thing is, right,
to
so if we wanted to use HTMX in here, now we can. So I can add in, if I wanted to add a search endpoint here, it's very simple. I'm just going to add an app. I might do a post and do API search. And, I have a search request handler. I'd have to write that search request handler. And then I could pass that over to whatever search thing that I'm working with. But now I can do that. I can return it, or that search handler could just return the main layout and return me all of the HTML that I need, and then it's going to work with HTMX really nicely.
So how long did it take you for building it all from zero to the end of editing experience?
So the full editing
Assuming you
experience.
didn't know Go.
Yeah, so I learned Go. I did one course on it, and then I did the Hello World thing, but probably all in, if I'd have been working on it full time, probably 2 weeks. I'd have got it in there. Most of the time was spent reverse engineering JSS, right, and figuring out how all of the editing information worked together. But yeah, it was fun though. Get it working it all out and getting to know Go. It's an interesting language. It's really fun to use. Like you see, it's monstrously fast. But I think Netcore probably could equal speed for this type of functionality. Um, for what we're doing, the language that's running the server side stuff isn't usually the bottleneck. It's usually, getting the data from Edge, getting the data from third party applications or third party APIs. That's where your bottlenecks are coming in. But for pure brute speed of processing the templating engine and parsing all the data and spitting it out on the page, I don't think there's much that would beat Go. It's just really impressive. Any other questions?
Rich, just to piggyback on Martin's, kudos on explanation of the metadata mode. Beautifully done. And when I kept on hearing about metadata mode, I kept on thinking to myself, why is it needed?
Yeah.
But that made it crystal clear. This was really good, and I think the only way you can get this cheaper in hosting is doing Google App Engine, where you can get even more fractions of a penny.
Hey, yeah, I'll look at that. If that can host a Go app, that'll be awesome.
Oh yeah. 10 years ago, I built some of the first Go apps on that, and yeah, it's fractions of a cent.
Nice, yeah, yeah. It's very very cheap to host. I would be super interested to see something in production using this, and comparing it, because I think, but it's going to have to be somebody brave, because it's not a traditional way of doing it. It was
Well,
fun as a thought exercise to do. I don't know how practical it would be in production, but it would definitely be cheap to host and very fast.
I was wondering how many Go CMSs there are, and I'm sure there are many Go projects that could use a CMS that just don't have one.
Could be.
Good job.
Thank you. All right, I'll stop my share there. Oh no, I think you Did you take host already, or did I stop share already?
You still share.
I'm still sharing.
Yeah. So you can now grab.
Oh, there it
this-
is.
You
There we
can now
go.
grab this Heroku URL and paste it into, set it up into Pages, and it will work as well.
Yeah, actually, yeah. Well, no, you know what? That wouldn't work. Yeah, let me. I'll. If you got time, I'll just run one last thing for that. So, this one wouldn't work right now because I didn't put the editing secret in, or any of the other information. So on the config variables, I just gave it the context ID and the site name and language, right? So this one here, that it's not running right now, but this was me testing doing all of the editing. So yeah, I put the editing secret in. I had some extra things. This was working off our staging environments, just to have some extra features that we were testing out. But yeah, absolutely, you could run this as your editing host instead of the XM Cloud one. Yep, 100%.
Now that really explains. Any more questions from the audience?
Learning a whole new language in 40 minutes is quite a lot.
Okay, if that is the case, I wish everyone happy festive season. Thank you, Rich, very much for presenting today, and
Thank you.
congratulations with your anniversary at Sitecore.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye all.